Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, and thank you for tuning in today. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button so you never miss any of our lessons, tips, and motivational talks on learning English or any other language. Today, we are going to talk about a very common challenge many language learners face: the fear of making errors. It might sound simple on the surface, but if you've ever been nervous about saying the wrong word, forgetting a crucial piece of grammar, or using a phrase incorrectly, you know how much anxiety it can cause. In this video, we're going to dive deep into why these fears exist and how we can train ourselves to overcome them in a constructive, rewarding way that actually leads to steady progress. By the end of this talk, you will realize that making mistakes is not just okay. It's a crucial part of the learning process, and every single one of us, no matter how advanced we are, benefits from embracing mistakes rather than running away from them. We'll explore real-world examples, personal stories, practical exercises, and ways to build a calm, constructive approach to every error you make. As always, feel free to share your experiences in the comment section and encourage one another because you're not alone. Everyone goes through this at one stage or another, and with the right mindset, it can become a natural, even exciting part of your journey toward mastering a new language. Let me start by telling you about a friend of mine, Ricardo, who moved from Brazil to an English-speaking country for a study-abroad program. He was extremely good at reading and writing in English. His teachers and peers often praised him for his excellent essays and insightful analyses. However, when it came time for him to speak up in class discussions, he would freeze. His vocabulary was quite broad, but the moment he even thought about opening his mouth, a rush of potential mistakes flooded his mind. He worried about pronouncing words incorrectly, using incorrect verb tenses, or mixing up the order of adjectives. Because he was so worried about making these errors, he ended up not speaking at all, or speaking in a voice so quiet that nobody could really hear him. The fear of embarrassment or the possibility that someone might think less of him because of a mistake halted him in his tracks. Eventually, he sought help, and through a series of steps, some of which I'll share with you today, he learned to turn that sense of fear into motivation. Mistakes became lessons, and each error he made pushed him to learn a more accurate usage, become more comfortable under pressure, and actually communicate more. By the end of his study abroad program, he was far more confident. He made plenty of mistakes along the way, of course, but as he likes to say now, the errors were the stepping stones to my real growth in English. That sense of being frozen by mistakes is something many of us can relate to. Perhaps you had a similar experience in a classroom, at your workplace, or even during a casual conversation with a friend or stranger. Before you say anything, your mind floods you with thoughts like, what if I use the wrong tense? What if the other person laughs at my accent? What if they can't understand what I'm trying to say? This is completely normal. The fear arises because humans generally don't enjoy being wrong or exposing gaps in their knowledge, especially in front of others. In many educational environments, mistakes have been historically penalized with poor grades or negative feedback, so we grow up with an implicit belief that mistakes are bad. However, we have to challenge this assumption when learning something as inherently interactive as language. Because if we avoid mistakes at all costs, we also avoid genuine practice. And if we avoid genuine practice, we never truly advance. Think of a small child learning their first language. They're not worried about making mistakes. In fact, they have no concept of mistakes at all. They babble, they mispronounce words, they say ungrammatical sentences, and the adults around them often just gently correct them. Yet, over time, those children become fluent speakers. They don't have that fear that so often plagues adults. One reason is that children have not yet developed a sense of shame or embarrassment around errors. They see an error and get corrected, and they move on, typically without a second thought. That's the mindset we want to try and tap into as adult learners. Seeing an error, absorbing the correction, and continuing forward without letting it paralyze our next attempt at speaking. One of the strategies that helped my friend Ricardo was deliberately practicing in environments where mistakes were expected and even welcomed. He joined a local conversation club at the university where once or twice a week, international students gathered to speak English with each other. The rules were simple. You could talk about anything, but you had to do it in English. And if you heard someone make a mistake, you offered polite, constructive feedback. Now, because everyone in that room was also an English learner, it was a safe environment. No one was there to judge or mock each other. In fact, the errors became a catalyst for group discussion. "Oh, is that how you say that expression?" Or actually, that phrase might sound more natural this way. Over time, Ricardo realized that when he made a mistake, other people didn't look down on him. They either didn't notice, or if they did notice, they gave him a helpful suggestion and then moved on. That alone helped break the fear cycle. He realized that an error was not the end of the world. And for many watchers of this channel who feel the same fear, finding or creating a safe environment, even online, can accelerate your progress dramatically. If you can't find a conversation club in your physical location, there are plenty of online forums, video chat groups, or language exchange apps where you can connect with people around the world who are more than happy to help you learn, just as you can help them. Another very useful concept is to create a mental script for yourself whenever you feel that fear creeping in. Fear often escalates because we create catastrophic predictions in our mind. I'll say something wrong. Someone will laugh at me. I'll look foolish. I'll never recover from that embarrassment, and so on. We can counter this by reminding ourselves of actual facts. Everyone makes mistakes. No one learns a language perfectly from day one. Most people are too busy with their own concerns to dwell on my errors. And each time I make a mistake, I learn something valuable that brings me closer to fluency. By repeatedly telling yourself these truths, you gradually rewire your brain to accept that errors are just another step in the journey. This mental shift can have a profound impact on your willingness to speak up in class, join a conversation group, or even practice with a language partner. Now let me share another story, this one about Hannah. Hannah grew up in a non-English speaking country but attended an international high school where most subjects were taught in English. She was naturally shy, but in her native language, she at least felt comfortable speaking to friends. In English, however, that shyness amplified because she was convinced her classmates would notice her accent or her occasional grammar slips. She would memorize entire presentations word for word, terrified that forgetting a single line would expose her as not truly fluent. But one day in class, the teacher asked her a surprise question while discussing a text they'd read. Hannah had no script to rely on, so she had to improvise. She stumbled over a verb tense, repeated herself, and eventually got her point across. She felt a wave of embarrassment at first, but to her surprise, the teacher simply nodded, acknowledged her answer, and moved on. Nobody laughed or criticized her. In that moment, Hannah realized that the fear was much larger in her head than in reality. That was the beginning of her journey to being more comfortable with off-the-cuff speaking. She later joined a theater club where students performed short sketches in English. This forced her to speak spontaneously and inevitably make mistakes during rehearsals. But each mistake was a chance to refine her performance. By the time the actual show took place, she was confident because she had learned so much from all the errors made in practice. Her success story highlights something crucial: immersion in an activity that inherently expects mistakes, like rehearsals, helps diminish our anxiety. When everyone is messing up lines and laughing together, you see that it's part of the creative process, part of progress. You can adopt that same spirit in language learning contexts. Another practical tip is to record yourself speaking. This can be daunting for many learners because hearing your own voice might initially be uncomfortable. But if you're worried about mistakes in public, start in private. Use your phone or computer, pick a short topic to discuss, maybe summarizing a news article you read, describing your day, or talking about a personal interest, and record a few minutes of speech. Then listen back. The first thing you might notice is that you don't sound as bad as you feared. You might catch certain repeated errors, like mispronouncing a certain vowel or consistently mixing up past tense endings. Write those errors down and record again, focusing on improvement. Over time, you'll become more aware of your frequent slip-ups, and you'll be able to correct them before they become ingrained habits. This method also helps you become comfortable with your own voice in English, building confidence for when you speak with others. Let's delve deeper into why we fear mistakes so much. Often, it's about social judgment. We imagine that others will think less of us if we speak imperfectly. However, consider how you react when you hear someone speaking your native language with an accent or making small errors. Most likely, you think, "Wow, they're making a real effort," or "good for them for trying." The same kindness typically applies in reverse. Native speakers of English generally appreciate non-natives making an effort to communicate, and they are quite tolerant of minor mistakes. It's rare that anyone will mock or belittle you, and if someone does, it says more about them than about you. Indeed, many English speakers find accents charming or interesting because they reveal the speaker's background or culture. Understanding that the judgment we fear is not usually something we face in reality can be liberating. Another technique is to set tangible goals around making mistakes. It sounds counterintuitive, but try telling yourself, "I'm going to speak up 5 times today in class or in a meeting, and if I make at least 3 mistakes, that means I really pushed myself and practiced." Turning errors into a point of pride, because it means you're pushing beyond your comfort zone, can transform your perspective. Instead of trying to have a flawless conversation, you aim for genuine communication, and any mistakes that arise are simply evidence that you're actively using your language skills. Then, after you meet your mistake quota, reflect on what you learned. This relabels mistakes as progress markers rather than failures. Many language learners also benefit from a mistake journal. After you finish a conversation session, note down specific errors you recall making, whether it's misuse of a vocabulary word, mixing up prepositions, or stumbling over a specific phrase. Then, write the correct usage next to it. Review this journal periodically and try to incorporate the corrected forms into your future conversations. Over time, you'll see patterns in your mistakes, and you can systematically address them. Maybe you realize you consistently misuse in and on for time expressions. Well, that becomes your focus for the next week. This approach transforms mistakes from random, shameful moments into a structured part of your study routine, giving you the sense that each slip-up is a chance to refine your skills. Let's talk about how to stay calm during a conversation, especially when you sense you might be about to make an error. One strategy is to practice mindfulness. Take a slow breath before responding. This reduces the fight or flight response that might kick in when you're nervous about making a mistake. If your mind is racing with anxious thoughts, the likelihood of stumbling over words increases. By simply inhaling and exhaling deeply, you give yourself a moment to gather your thoughts and remind yourself that making a mistake isn't a disaster. A calm mind often communicates more clearly, And if an error happens, you're more likely to handle it gracefully. You can also prepare rescue phrases that help you navigate mistakes. For instance, if you get stuck mid-sentence and can't think of the right word, you might say, "I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought," or "let me rephrase that." Or what I mean to say is, using these phrases in a confident, calm tone will signal to your conversation partner that you're simply clarifying or correcting yourself, which is completely normal in any conversation, even among native speakers. Notice how often native English speakers say things like, "Actually, let me correct that," or "I misspoke," or "I'm not sure if that's the best word." These are natural cues that conversation is an evolving process, not a perfect performance. By adopting similar cues, you'll feel more comfortable acknowledging small slip-ups and moving on. Let me illustrate with another personal story. My cousin Lucia was trying to master phone conversations in English for her customer service job. She dreaded picking up the phone when she saw an English-speaking number on the caller ID, certain she'd misunderstand something or pronounce a client's name incorrectly. One day, she decided to systematically approach this fear. She started answering those calls more often instead of passing them to her colleague. She informed her team leader that she was working on her spoken English and welcomed any feedback. Initially, she stumbled a few times, forgetting certain words, but her team was supportive. When she did make an error, like mixing up the words invoice and receipt, she'd note it down and practice correct usage after the call. Within a couple of weeks, she was noticeably more fluent and significantly less anxious. She realized that once you survive a few awkward moments, you see that the fear is far worse than the actual outcome. Clients, in her experience, were mostly understanding, and if she needed to clarify something, she simply asked them politely to repeat or explain. This direct exposure to her fear in a slightly structured environment, with a supportive team leader, helped her move from terrified avoidance to confident handling of English phone calls. Her story is a reminder that seeking out controlled but real environments to practice can accelerate the process of overcoming that fear of making errors. Now you may be wondering about perfectionism. Many learners hold themselves to extremely high standards. They think, "I don't want to speak until I can speak perfectly." But perfectionism can be the enemy of progress. Language is about communication, not about being 100% flawless. Even highly educated native speakers make slip-ups and rephrase what they say. If you wait until you can speak perfectly, you might be waiting forever. The best route is to accept that perfection is unattainable, especially in the early and intermediate stages. Instead, focus on being clear enough to be understood and let the minor mistakes be stepping stones to improvement. Indeed, that's what mistakes are. Each one can teach you something new if you remain open to the lesson. Another tip is to surround yourself with supportive peers or tutors. If you find yourself in a negative environment where people constantly criticize or ridicule any error, you're less likely to take the risks needed to progress. Seek out friends, study buddies, conversation partners, or teachers who give you gentle, constructive feedback. Constructive feedback, for example, might be something like, "I see what you're trying to say, but here's a slightly more natural way to phrase it," rather than harsh remarks like, "That's totally wrong, your pronunciation is awful." The former fosters growth, while the latter fosters fear. And if you ever do encounter unkind responses, try to move away from those contexts and remind yourself that the problem lies with their attitude, not with your learning process. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about how to systematically correct your mistakes once you've made them. Because fear often comes from the belief that we'll keep making the same errors forever. One straightforward method is error analysis. Whenever you speak or write in English, collect the errors you notice or that someone points out and categorize them. Grammar like incorrect verb tense, vocabulary wrong word choice, pronunciation misplacing stress or mixing up vowel sounds, or syntax incorrect word order. Then you target each category with specific practice. For grammar issues, you might review a lesson or do targeted exercises. For vocabulary mix-ups, you can make flashcards that show the difference between similar words or synonyms. For pronunciation, recording yourself and using online pronunciation tools can be quite effective. Over time, you'll see certain patterns. Maybe you frequently forget to add the S at the end of third-person singular verbs in the present tense. He go to work instead of he goes to work. Once you've identified that pattern, you can pay extra attention to it in your next speaking practice. This transforms random errors into a structured learning plan. Let me tell you about yet another person I know, a language teacher named Akira, who was born in Japan and learned English to a near-native level. Akira told his students about his own journey and how he frequently mixed up L and R sounds in his early years of learning English. Instead of getting discouraged or feeling ashamed every time someone pointed it out, he decided to make a game of it. He'd practice minimal pairs, words that differ in only one sound, like light and right, collect and correct, plate and prate, and he'd record himself, listening carefully for improvements. He did this daily, just a few minutes each time, focusing on the mouth position and the acoustic difference. Each time he discovered he still wasn't perfect, he'd refine his approach. Eventually, he got so proficient that he now speaks English with barely a trace of accent. His story shows how turning a repeated mistake into a focused learning exercise, approached calmly and methodically, can yield remarkable results. Instead of letting the fear of messing up R and L paralyze him into silence, he embraced the challenge and improved exponentially. In line with that, it's also useful to develop a sense of humor about your mistakes. Humor diffuses tension and makes the learning process more enjoyable. If you accidentally say something silly, or if your direct translation from your native language results in a strange phrase in English, laugh it off. Recognize it as part of the process. Share funny mistakes with friends. This encourages a culture of openness and mutual support. In fact, some language learners keep a little funny mistakes list, which becomes a source of amusement and humility. Reading them later often reveals how far you've come when you see that you no longer make those same errors. Now let's talk about the psychological side of fear. Sometimes, fear of mistakes in language learning ties into larger anxieties about being judged or not measuring up to others' expectations. If you find that you have deep-seated anxieties, it might help to employ some general anxiety management techniques. Breathing exercises, journaling, affirmations, or even talking to a counselor about performance anxiety can all be helpful. Language learning can sometimes trigger these broader anxieties, so it's worth addressing them holistically. Understanding that your self-worth is not determined by how well you conjugate a verb can be a big step forward. As you continue your journey, setting realistic milestones is another key element. Don't aim for fluent in 3 months without any mistakes. Instead, you might aim for have a 5-minute conversation on the phone, even if I make some errors without freezing up. That's a manageable, realistic goal. When you achieve it, even if you messed up a few verbs or words, celebrate that you made yourself understood for 5 whole minutes on the phone. Then move on to your next milestone. Maybe have a 10-minute conversation with a native speaker about current events. Or give a short presentation at work and handle the Q&A. Each milestone builds your confidence and resilience, showing that you can indeed function in English even when mistakes happen. Another aspect to keep in mind is focusing on context instead of perfection. Often, language is about delivering a message or achieving a goal, not about being grammatically flawless. Did you manage to order food successfully at a restaurant? Great. The waiter understood you and you got your meal. Did you chat with a friend and have a good time? Perfect. That is communication success. If you used a wrong preposition or made a small grammar error along the way, it likely didn't interfere with the main purpose. Of course, as you advance, you can polish and refine those details, but in the meantime, appreciate the fact that you succeeded in communicating. That focus on functional success rather than grammatical perfection can reduce anxiety and help you see mistakes as minor bumps rather than major catastrophes. Let me also point out a resource that many people find invaluable: speaking with other non-native speakers who are more advanced than you. This might sound odd at first, but those advanced learners still remember their own struggles vividly. They can share how they overcame specific stumbling blocks. For instance, maybe they had trouble with the subjunctive mood or the difference between make and do. If they overcame that fear and those errors, their personal tips might resonate even more than advice from a native speaker who could have forgotten what it's like to be in your position. Surrounding yourself with peers or slightly more advanced learners who can empathize with your fear of errors can be incredibly comforting and motivating. At the same time, be sure to expose yourself to native-level speech as well, whether through videos, podcasts, or in-person interactions. Hearing natural speech patterns, intonation, and vocabulary usage will help your ear become more attuned to nuances. Initially, you might not catch everything. That's normal. As you train, you'll begin to notice repeating phrases, collocations, and grammar structures. You might try using them in your next conversation. If you slip up, that's just the next step in learning. Another technique is to break down your learning process into smaller steps to reduce the chance of feeling overwhelmed. For example, if you want to master telephone English, you can start by memorizing a few typical phrases for greetings, stating your reason for calling, asking for clarification, and ending the call. Practice those phrases in a low-pressure environment, maybe even talking to yourself or recording them. Then, the next time you have to make a phone call, you have this mini script to rely on. If you deviate from the script and make a small mistake, so be it. You'll correct it later. Over time, you can expand that script to handle more complex conversations. This modular approach builds confidence step by step, and each minor success helps you conquer your fear of errors little by little. You can also practice role-playing with friends or tutors, intentionally introducing mistakes to see how they might respond. For instance, you might say, "I have many works to do," knowing it's slightly off, so your friend or tutor can demonstrate a friendly correction. We usually say, "I have a lot of work to do." This structured exercise actually helps you anticipate possible errors and see that correction is not a negative thing but a normal part of speaking. It also trains you to handle corrections gracefully. Instead of reacting with embarrassment or shame, you practice responding with a calm, "Oh, thank you. Let me try that again," which reduces your fear of being corrected in real, spontaneous interactions. Remember that language is a social tool. When you speak, you're usually trying to connect with someone, share an idea, or accomplish a task. Fear of mistakes can hinder that connection because it might prevent you from speaking altogether or cause you to speak in a hesitant, anxious manner. But if you look at language from a purely communicative perspective, you'll see that any attempt to speak is already valuable. Most people appreciate the effort you're making. A small slip in grammar or vocabulary is typically overshadowed by your willingness to communicate and your clarity of intent. As the saying goes, a well-communicated idea with minor errors is still far more powerful than a silent thought never shared. Now I want to bring up another angle. Sometimes the fear of mistakes can come from having had a bad experience in the past, maybe with a teacher or classmates who ridiculed you. If that's the case, part of the healing process is recognizing that not all learning environments are like that. You can create or find supportive communities. You can also remind yourself that the negative experience is in the past and that you are now in control of your learning journey. It might take time to rebuild your confidence, but by exposing yourself gradually to more positive experiences, like a friendly online study group or a supportive teacher, you can overwrite those old, hurtful memories with new, affirming ones. Let me share an anecdote about a time I was learning a different language, Spanish. I was traveling through a Spanish-speaking country, and on one occasion I tried to explain something complicated about my travel plans to a hotel receptionist. I got my verb tenses tangled, mispronounced a few words, and basically made a bit of a linguistic mess. The receptionist paused for a moment, obviously trying to parse what I was saying, and then asked if I could clarify one aspect. I took a deep breath, tried again with simpler vocabulary, and we figured it out. Afterward, I felt a surge of embarrassment, but the receptionist just smiled and said, "Tu español está muy bien, solo practica más." Your Spanish is very good, just practice more. That was an important lesson for me. Even though I definitely messed up a lot of grammar in that exchange, communication still happened and the other person gave me kind, constructive feedback. Whenever I felt that pang of nervousness in future interactions, I remembered that this fear was all in my head. The real situation was not humiliating. It was an opportunity to connect, to learn, and to keep refining my skills. That experience also reminds me of a powerful mindset shift. Treat every conversation, every email, every text message, and every attempt to speak or write as a mini practice session. Instead of seeing it as a potential pitfall for mistakes, see it as a chance to refine your language skills. Some advanced learners I know actually get excited when they realize they've made a mistake because it means they've discovered a blind spot that they can now fix, thereby getting one step closer to mastery. It's almost like a game. Find the error, correct it, level up. With that mindset, fear gets replaced by a sort of adventurous curiosity. Of course, we also have to address the importance of repetition in overcoming fear. The more often you speak, the more chances you have to make mistakes, and consequently, the more chances you have to learn from them. It's a numbers game to an extent. If you only speak once a week, you'll have fewer errors to learn from, and it might feel like each conversation is a high-stakes event. If you speak a little every day, your errors will be more spread out, and each one will seem less monumental. You'll also see improvements in real time. So if you're serious about overcoming your fear of mistakes, commit to frequent practice. That could mean finding a language exchange partner you talk to daily, recording a short vlog in English each morning and listening back to it in the evening, or engaging with an online group chat. Consistency is key. Also, keep in mind that language evolves and even native speakers might correct themselves. We hear them say something like, "I have did, sorry, I have done that before," or he came over last night. Nobody thinks, "Oh no, they made an error, they must be incompetent." We recognize that speaking spontaneously sometimes leads to slip-ups. That recognition should reassure you that your mistakes are part of being human, not a reflection of your intelligence or ability. If you still struggle with fear even after employing these strategies, you might consider working with a professional tutor or coach who specializes in building speaking confidence. They can give you one-on-one attention, simulate real-life scenarios, and gently push you out of your comfort zone. Some people find it easier to break through their fear with personalized guidance, especially if they have deep anxieties or have gone through negative experiences in the past. A good tutor will celebrate your efforts, correct you in an encouraging way, and help you track your progress so you can visibly see that your mistakes are decreasing or at least changing as you get better. Finally, remember to celebrate your successes. Every time you make yourself understood, every time you manage to correct a repeated error, every time you speak up when you previously would have stayed silent, those are wins. Keep track of them. Reward yourself mentally or even with a small treat. This positive reinforcement will help you associate speaking practice with triumph rather than embarrassment. Over time, those small wins accumulate into a big sense of confidence, and you'll wonder why you were ever so worried about making mistakes in the first place. So, to summarize everything in a continuous flow without separating it into chapters or headings, we began by welcoming you and asking you to subscribe to the channel, setting the stage for discussing this common and important topic of overcoming the fear of making errors in language learning. We examined why fear arises, often stemming from a dread of social judgment or from a perfectionist mindset, and we saw that mistakes are not only inevitable but beneficial. Through real-life examples and stories of learners like Ricardo, Hannah, Lucia, and my own experiences with Spanish, we discovered that mistakes lead to deeper understanding and growth. We talked about practical techniques such as joining a supportive conversation club, using mental scripts and positive self-talk, systematically analyzing errors to turn them into structured learning targets, and employing mindfulness to stay calm. We discussed the power of exposing ourselves to real scenarios like phone calls or role plays, preparing rescue phrases to handle slip-ups, and rewriting our approach to mistakes by celebrating them as stepping stones. We recognized the value of repeated practice, setting realistic milestones, focusing on functionality over perfection, and finding communities or tutors who encourage rather than belittle us. Throughout this entire exploration, the recurring theme is that an error is a natural part of any learning trajectory, particularly in language learning, and if we shift our perspective to see it as an opportunity rather than a threat, we liberate ourselves from the paralyzing grip of fear. We concluded by emphasizing the importance of celebrating every small success, as these are the building blocks of long-term confidence and mastery. I hope you found this discussion insightful and that it motivates you to go out there and make as many good mistakes as necessary to continue your progress. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and if you found this helpful, give the video a like or share it with friends who might also be battling the fear of making errors. Feel free to leave a comment with your own stories, fears, or triumphs in language learning. We learn best from one another's experiences, so your story might just be the inspiration someone else needs. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this supportive community. Keep practicing, keep embracing those inevitable mistakes, and remember, every step, no matter how small or imperfect, is a step forward on your path to fluency.